what we've done is we've created a homelessness industry, sadly, and there's a lot of investment in that industry of homelessness and no voices of the people who are actually homeless. And when those voices are in that space, it's often in a way that evokes charity and pity and sadness and distress and trauma. And I just didn't really want to be part of that system. I wanted to be part of an advocacy system that fought for rights and that had a good analysis of the structural and systemic causes of this problem.
Kia ora and welcome to the Homefulness Show. I'm your host, Zola Rose, located in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We believe housing can be a means for regenerative placemaking to create affordable and sustainable homes and neighborhoods developed in collaboration with the communities that live there. We'll be exploring different housing models and neighborhood designs and innovation in energy, water, waste, construction, land use, and food systems. We showcase housing policies, finance, funding, and community engagement to unlock this potential. This show aims to empower you with knowledge, resources, and networks to support you in creating great places to live. Come join us as we bring to life the more beautiful housing that we know is possible. I'm recording this episode on the 23rd of September 2024. I'm currently in Brisbane in South East Queensland, Australia. I have just finished working with the Housing Older Women movement for the last 2 weeks. We have had a whirlwind tour, a series of community engagement events to catalyze affordable, community-led, and regenerative housing development, particularly that focuses older women but does not exclude other generations. In fact, they really want to promote intergenerational neighborhoods. So the way we structured the community engagement events was to have a 2-hour seminar of background information of what is the problem with housing that we are tackling. And then I go through solutions that have been done successfully in other countries such as the UK and America, where the community land trust, the cooperative housing, and the co-housing models primarily are the ones that give the best outcomes in terms of social connection, belonging, resilience, ecological sustainability. Economically, they are more fair and just. And I give a lot of examples of the return on investment that when public money is used to assist these community-led housing projects, that there's a 3-to-1 return on investment. That is from a study in the UK where it shows that the government is saving money that it would otherwise spend on emergency housing or homelessness services or mental health services to be able to have a stable community. And so those are the kind of statistics that I was giving that show that this is a collaborative process that takes much more than just the residents themselves to be able to develop these communities. And then we go into a 3-hour workshop where we get a chance to drill down into how would that look in terms of a project on the ground in that community. What are the assets and what can we build upon that's already existing that could move us into a project. But we also talk about the systemic barriers and enablers, and what are the policy changes that need to happen that would facilitate these projects. Because at the moment, the reason why we don't have so many projects is because we actually do have too many barriers. We had these series of events in the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, North Brisbane, South Brisbane. We had what we called a sector influencers meeting at the University of Queensland. And then I got to have an in-house workshop with the Gold Coast City Council, who is really keen on looking at what is community land trust, how could that work for them as a way to enable perpetually affordable housing. And then when we were on the Sunshine Coast, we had members of the City Council who are very interested also in the CLT model, as they already have it in their housing strategy and so really want to look at what land might be available for a project. Luckily, there is a lot of interest in community land trust in Australia in certain areas. We heard people reflect that they felt a lot more hopeful and more clear on what the solutions that they can advocate for. I'm very grateful to the Housing Older Women movement to have done the fundraising to be able to bring me here to Australia, to be able to do work that I am really passionate about and causes that I feel incredibly strong about, which is perpetually affordable, regenerative, and community-led housing. Now that we've got a method that we believe is great for mobilizing community and informing key stakeholders, I would like to invite you to consider bringing me to your local community or to your council to run similar events and in-house training for council staff. Be in touch with me at zola@commonground.net.nz, where we can then discuss how this could work for your community. And now that I'm finished with the series of engagement events, I'm going to take some time to visit 2 eco-villages. I visited Crystal Waters, which was formed about 40 years ago now in Sunshine Coast up in the mountains, really beautiful. It's a wildlife sanctuary as well, so I got to see so much wildlife, including kangaroos and wallabies, which is my first time to see in the wild. And that was a really interesting community that I think deserves its own episode. And I'm going to go to Byron Bay and check out that area. And then I'm going to spend some time at Narara Eco Village. They've been around for many years now, have many residents there. I'm looking forward to checking out what makes that eco village work. How did they get started? And I think that's also for another episode. So enjoy today's show, where you're going to hear from 2 founders of the Housing Older Women movement, Maggie and Lynette. The first woman that you'll hear speaking is Lynette. I'm interested to know from both of you, what was your home and housing like growing up, and how has it been for you through adulthood?
I grew up, my childhood was spent on dairy farms and a little bit of my early adulthood. So there's a different kind of neighbourliness that's happening with the next door farmers and their families helping each other and sharing a lift to town to take the children. But that neighbourliness, I was always looking for the friendly neighbourly relationship in suburban situations, and finding that nearly everyone had gone to work, and when they were home, I was busy cooking my family's dinner. I wasn't finding it easy to interact with neighbours, or to find ones who weren't reclusive or withdrawn. And then I discovered through the permaculture organisation in Western Australia the concept of co-housing. Immediately bought the first English language book about co-housing, and myself and about 8 or 10 others were in one of the small groups that formed in Western Australia to say, hey, let's do this. Let's find a place just on the edge of Perth. I turned up living in New Zealand, and I very soon came across the fact that a group was forming in Auckland, New Zealand, and began to involve myself with it. And in the next few years, stepped more boldly into their group that was working towards having a suburban, environmentally sustainable, socially sustainable, and Earthsong Eco neighbourhood came into reality from an idea, a concept. A lot of people put their dream together and worked with each other and cooperated with each other and learned how to cooperate with the city council, but it has become the regional council in Auckland. And in late 2000, I'm one of the people who moved into the first 5 houses in Earthsong Eco neighbourhood, and I very sadly left when it was necessary to come back to live in Australia to be nearer to my grandchildren. Most wonderful and satisfying adventure in my life was the creation and establishment and living in sustainable and supportive neighbourhood.
And there is actually a book that Robin's now written called Co-Housing for Life. So if
Yes,
people
on
are
my shelf.
interested to check out the first co-housing eco neighborhood in Aotearoa, that book gives the story of from conception all the way to being able to live. And it's a great story, so recommend that. And
Yes.
you, Maggie, how did you grow up and how has your housing been like in adulthood?
Well, I grew up in public housing, and my mother secured that house that I grew up in a small country town in South East Queensland by going to the local member's office with me as a baby of 6 months and saying she would not leave the premises until she had the keys to a house. Because we had been living in a caravan on the banks of a little creek, and that was threatening to flood. And my father worked out west putting up poles and wires. So we secured this home, and it was part of the post-war public housing development that occurred across Australia. And Queensland managed to create about 3.4% of that type of household in our state to build that much. But we had the lowest percentage of such housing of any state in Australia. So I grew up and rented then for the rest of my adult life. I've only ever rented, unlike many of the Housing Older Women movement participants who have been part of, as has Lynette, purchasing over 5 properties in some instances, but never finally reaching a point where the next rung of the ladder was too high and they didn't have access to a loan offering from any of the financial institutions to allow them to reach that next rung on the property ladder. So they used up their funds in renting privately, which is a bit sad, really, because often most of those women had no superannuation and little other savings. So it's been an unfortunate experience for many women. I've continued to rent until I reached a point when I lost my job and the house I'd been renting for 25 years in the same week. And then I had an experience of serious housing precarity because I'd applied for many, many rental houses. But when you don't have a job and you're in your late 50s, you're in a very vulnerable situation. So I was fortunate that a co-worker who's part of an organization asked me what was happening, and I told him the story, and he said, look, we've got the underneath of a house that's available and you could use that on a temporary basis. But I've been here now probably 7 years because there's no other options available to me that's affordable.
And in terms of aspirations, do you aspire to something that's more collective in nature?
Yes, well, I'm a community worker. I've worked at a locality level. I forgot to mention that in all of that story, I was part of setting up a housing cooperative in Mackay when I lived there with my family. And I was one of the founding members of that development called Shalom Housing. And it actually lasted for the last 35 years. It owned 15 properties, and we helped design and build 4 units of accommodation on a piece of land close to the city of Mackay. And it would still be operating now as it has done for 35 years, except that the national housing standards required them to comply with a set of standards that was way beyond the capacity of a little volunteer group of people to provide the required auditing. They had the houses at the standard, but the auditing of those standards every year was just way too much for that little group. And they've now given over the houses to a local community housing provider, and they've lost all the autonomy and agency they had. So that's a sad story, actually, but a good one insofar as it shows that housing cooperatives such as that do exist and can exist and do operate and have operated in Queensland.
So just going back to the kind of housing that you both aspire to, would it be something that functions a bit like a co-housing or more like cooperative housing?
I think cooperative housing, in my mind, is the legal structure that goes around a kind of housing for the common good. And a typology of that housing that has a particular appeal to me is the co-housing model, because I get to live a private life in my own living space, and I get to share common amenities with others. And where, as a single woman, that's a really very pleasant idea that I would share a meal with people on a regular basis, or as it might occur informally, that I would live not just with people my own age, but live in a mixed tenure type of environment, that I would be involved in designing and planning in some way the shape and form of this housing, that I would share decision making with others. So that's kind of feels right to me as a community worker, that I would live in community while retaining a sense of my own personal and private space. So that's the model that appeals to me most.
Thank you. And Lynette, what would you say for yourself?
I'm much the same, because I have seen and I've believed in the benefit of everyone knowing what's going on, able to participate when they see that they can. And I've experienced with great pleasure in Earthsong Eco Neighbourhood, but also in some of my other neighbourly relations in ordinary rentals since I came to Brisbane, that somebody offers just what you need, or speaks up that they're going to something, and would you either like to come with me, or can I get you some of organic vegetables or something while I'm down there? And little things like that are a great boost in, and not just because I'm an older person now that it's nice to feel supported. I'm talking about people not being isolated within their household and required to do everything and find everything. For instance, parents of very small children can suffer an awful kind of a social isolation, except that they meet other mothers at playgroup. And that's sort of such a limited thing compared to what you can have in multi-generational neighbourly living. And really, it doesn't have to be set up as co-housing if a housing development can have quite a number of physical build features that promote and draw people out from their dwellings. Oh, it's a sunny spot over there near the common building. I'll take my mid-morning cuppa over there to get some sunshine if I'm working at home or whatever. And somebody sees you do that and decides, oh, take my coffee over and have it with her. Things like that are little standard raising compared to sort of feeling, as many people have said when we were looking for people to join Earthsong Eco Neighbourhood before it was created, while we were gathering the group, many people spoke of that being their reason to not feel so isolated in a fully built suburb, but nobody's home. And some cooperation and sharing, and that can include a lot of cost savings. You can have facilities that don't need much care, or that the person who loves doing that sort of work, that's their contribution, compared to someone who loves minding the little children, might be contributing in a totally different way.
And so what would you say are your values around housing when you think about housing as a system? What set of values are driving you to be volunteers with the Housing Older Women movement, and what has influenced those values?
When we were forming Housing Older Women movement, I had already for a few years been aware that it wasn't my fault. I hadn't done or failed to do what you should do. I had in fact done things that you should do, like have a job and start buying a house. But it had become clear to me nearly 10 years before we formed this group that I did all the things that the housing system expects me to do, except stay in the same district, in the same house, with the same job and able to keep paying the same mortgage. I didn't even keep the same husband. I became single with children after a while. But those changes are not crimes that I committed or foolish, irresponsible choices. They are life. This is what happens. People have illnesses, a job disappears. So I see a sort of an unfairness that makes me cranky. What can I do with this rather than having it gnawing away inside me? Turn that energy into action. And that's been my driving thing with housing for older women, because of that enormous number of women, enormous percentage of the homeless and in danger of homeless section of the population. I want to see more housing system change that will make it easily, convenient, manageably possible for all levels of people to be able to have some sort of long-term tenure, even if it's rented, that we could have a different management of the rental leases, but also that there be more opportunities to buy into and be paying off something that you are expecting to live in as long as you need to, or until you die, and then you're leaving something to be inherited, but not at the full top market rate that all these $1 million houses.
So what I'm hearing from you is you're driven by that sense of injustice, unfairness that life has dealt particularly women, with them ending up in a adverse housing situation, either renting where they would prefer to buy or not being in the kind of neighborhood that meets their needs. And you would like for there to be easier ways for people to be involved in where they're living, and affordability, be able to get in with what they have. So that's fantastic. That is your driver. Perhaps your adversity is now benefiting through your advocacy work in this space. And you, Maggie, what would you say are your values and what has driven you to do this work?
Yes, well, I guess the common good is a value that I've held for a long time. So what is for the common good, as opposed to what is just for the individual's good and well-being? And they're not necessarily separate. However, we have got them out of balance somewhat, and particularly the housing sector has got them out of balance for a number of reasons. And the impact has been the impact on older women in particular, because we're such a vulnerable group. We're vulnerable because we've gone through decades of gender inequity. And when you do the analysis and you listen to the stories that line up with that, you understand that if you were born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s, and you didn't have a double income household for that whole adult life that you lived, and you've reached the age of 55 or older, and you've worked in feminized industries that paid very little, or you were mostly a caregiver with unpaid work, and you didn't have access to child support mandatory until 1988. You didn't have access to protection from domestic and family violence laws, which weren't introduced until the 1990s. And you didn't have access to super until the 1992, but you were on a low income anyway. So you were never going to acquire much super 20 years later. By the time you lost your job and couldn't find another job because of ageism. So you have the intersection of gender inequity, ageism, and then the big clincher was that in the 1990s, many governments around the world, including Australia, shifted from the provision of housing, rental housing, to the private market, and gave investors who invested in private rental accommodation the opportunity to become quite wealthy through that investment, underpinned by the public purse. And that underpinning was in the form of negative gearing and in the form of capital gains, advantages, and a bunch of other things that actually add up at the moment, in Australia at least, to about $70 billion a year in subsidised assistance to those who are providing rental in the private rental market. And at the same time, what then happened was that government withdrew from the provision of social and affordable housing. So that was the clincher. It said, okay, well, we're giving the private rental market all this support. We don't need to do this anymore. The private market will take care of it. Well, it didn't. And the consequences now being lived, particularly by older women who are the fastest growing group of people experiencing homelessness, many developed countries around the world. So it's not just Australia and New Zealand, it's Ireland, the UK, it's Canada, the US, and countries like Greece and a bunch of other places that did exactly that same set of scenarios or public policy positions. And also that there's a level of ageism that really impacts your ability to have more diverse choices in terms of your housing. So that analysis, my commitment to social justice, and my own needs, as well as the needs of many women I know. And in fact, we've got 2,200 followers on our Facebook page, mostly who are older women in the same situation as I'm in, and many of us are in. And we have over 600 people on our database who are supporters, as well as women who with lived experience of housing precarity. And that precarity extends from homelessness and spending years in states of homelessness, but being invisible because they did house sitting and couch surfing and anything they could to remain invisible, because we've lived conventional lives. We're not women who've lived, like many, sadly, on further fringes than we have, and suffered a great deal of trauma, which just transformed their lives, and might live rough or might lived a much further edge than we do. But our lives have been very conventional, raising families, helping out with the local footy club and local whatever that our kids were involved with, at school tuck shops, all that sort of stuff we did. And then took care of our families and our aged family members as they moved into the last years of their lives. So we've been caregivers and givers for all of our lives, and now find ourselves in the most vulnerable and horrible position possible, that is without housing. So that drives me to do what I do with a great passion.
Yes, there's a lot of compounding things. And again, that sense of injustice that these women have actually, like yourself, like myself, have been serving our communities in feminized ways and really giving quite a bit. And yet we are at the suffering end of how housing has treated us. So I've experienced all of what you talk about. That is what drives me as well. And it certainly is a strong driver, that sense of injustice for women who've been actually giving quite a bit to their communities and really deserve to be treated much better. We are also able to use that as fuel to drive our work in this space. Yeah. And so I was going to ask what inspired you to form or join HOW, but I'm quite interested to know just a bit of the history, where it did come from. It is a movement, and how it is that you came to be part of this particular organization.
Well, I couldn't find a job for a very long time. And I do recall looking up to the sky at one point and saying, okay, if there's any further work for me to do, then you really need to let me know. And I wasn't talking to any kind of individualized God. It was just kind of the universe saying, you really need to help me move forward somewhere. Anyway, it wasn't long actually before I got an offer to work with Queensland Shelter, which is a peak body for housing and homelessness in Queensland. It was only a 12-month contract, but I knew the CEO there, and I spoke to her about my experience and my observation that this was a growing issue. And a knock on the Q Shelter door came from a gentleman, Jeff Feidler, who was doing research with an organisation called Housing for the Aged Action Group based in Victoria, who'd managed to get some funding from the Wicking Trust to do some national study of what was going on with homelessness and older people, and in particular women in the country. So once we connected with Jeff, and we knew, then we started to get insights on the scope of the problem, which was enormous and growing. I spoke with the CEO and said, could we hold a meeting and bring people together? Most importantly, women affected by the issue, which is, as a community worker, where I start, is with the people most affected by the problem. And I wanted to bring those women into the space and to work with them, if they were in agreement, to try to bring about some change. Because what we've done is we've created a homelessness industry, sadly, and there's a lot of investment in that industry of homelessness, and no voices of the people who are actually homeless. And when those voices are in that space, it's often in a way that evokes charity and pity and sadness and distress and trauma. And I just didn't really want to be part of that system. I wanted to be part of an advocacy system that fought for rights and that had a good analysis of the structural and systemic causes of this problem. It wasn't because, as Lynette just said, we got divorced, or we got sick, or we got some other event that impacted our lives. They're just normal things that happen to everybody's lives and should not result in homelessness. So we had a much more comprehensive analysis of why this problem existed and the structural nature of the problem. And so we wanted to see if that first meeting led to a second meeting. And at the second meeting, that women there said, yes, we want to do something about it. And so in 2019, we had the first meeting in December and the second meeting in February the following year. And there were women present not just women with experience of housing precarity, but also women who cared about the problem. And one of the women proposed that we form the Housing Older Women's Movement. And that's what we did at that point. And that movement was led by women affected by the issue. The leadership of that group was gradually moved to others in the group who took control of the movement's defining its own vision and mission and where it wanted to go. It never shifted from being an advocacy movement. It never moved into becoming a housing provider itself. It did support the spin-off of a group of women who actually were involved with Zonta, and it was Zonta's policy position to support older women. And that group spun off, and they managed to use the considerable networks and resources of Zonta to form what has now become the Sharing with Friends Foundation. And that foundation now is at the point of having raised an awful lot of money to create a co-housing development with 5 women. And the reason that it's 5 isn't because they only wanted 5, it's because the current planning laws only made provision under the Rooming Act for there to be 5 with this type of development. And they've now got support from architects, pro bono support from big law firms. They had one lunch fundraiser last year. It raised $255,000 in one lunch fundraiser. So they know the right people to bring to the table. They know the right people to make money. So they still have an income and they have savings and a little bit of super. So they managed to make a contribution in their own right of $120,000 each. And each of those women will have will own their own private space and have access to the shared amenity space. So they've got agreements where they get their investment money back, either when they leave or when they die. It'll go to their estate. And pending how long they've been there, some money is paid back to the foundation to do some sprucing up of the house, so fresh paint and all of that. And they get a 6% increase. So the other important value is non-speculative in nature. So this is non-speculative housing. But what it offers the women is lifetime tenure. For the rest of their life, they can live there, whereas in the private market in Australia, at least, they've even gone down to 6 month contracts, rental contracts, so they can put the rent up more often. And 12 months is the average and most likely contract that you'll get in the private market. And that, as you age, is a horrendous possibility. And let me say, the other thing that's going on, which really irks me, is that all these caring support agencies and housing providers think they know what older women want. And what we want is a shoebox-sized little living space and some sort of shared amenity, and we de-treasure every single thing we own except a suitcase of things. I think that's appalling, and that comes from what an arrogance that they think they know what we want, when actually they haven't talked to us about it at all. So let's not kid ourselves that all women want to live in a shoebox and have virtually nothing left, and abandon every single treasure we ever owned, practically. So I think what we need is more choices and more options. And that's kind of housing isn't seen as transitional, rather it's being seen as permanent housing, the shoebox size one. And that's just not okay. We're not okay with that. Yeah.
And I'm hearing the Housing Older Women movement is really about bringing the women's voice to be able to design, co-design, and influence the choices and options that should be available to us. But if it's just left to the do-good organizations, they're just going to perhaps crunch all the numbers and say, well, this is probably all they can afford, and they're just going to have to downsize incredibly to be able to make it work. But we know that that's not a home, that's just a place to live, and
Correct.
it feels more transitional than it does long term. So it doesn't give that sense of belonging if you're just sort of given what others think that you should have. So the Housing Older Women movement, you're all volunteers. You're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, with a lot of hard work in the background for no pay, just for the outcomes that you hope will come out of this. And we've already talked about a lot of the challenges that you hope that are going to be addressed when House succeeds at getting different kinds of housing to be built and developed. Now, I know Housing Older Women is not a developer, not even a community housing provider, but is an influencer of community housing providers that wish to serve this population, or for-purpose developers who wish to be able to work alongside. So community engagement is about bringing out this mission of Housing Older Women to the wider community, and being able to get more people aware of the issues that are facing women, and get the input from not only women, but from other members of the community. What else was your thinking around this engagement series, and how did it shape up?
I guess essentially what we grew to understand, that the type of housing underpinned by the values that we held was not available. I mean, we're sharing with friends has worked for 4 years and is still struggling with that development, even though it's raised quite a lot of money and it's got the women in place, it's got the design, it's got all the legalities done, it's done a lot of work. But one of the key issues impacting it has been the planning issues, because it's been approved under the Rooming Act in Brisbane City Council's jurisdiction, which is not the right thing. The other thing we realised is that the type of housing, co-housing models, and the bottom-up kind of collaborative housing approaches like community land trusts and cooperative housing, legal structures and ways of living and working, connecting together around housing, are very rare. Well, virtually not happening in Queensland at all at an affordable level. It happens at the level of people being able to get together and buy a chunk of land together and create their own housing, although that's very rare too, to be honest. Crystal Waters is one example of that's happened in Queensland. We've been connecting nationally with structures like the Community Land Trust Network and Community Land Trust Organisation, another large peak level, cooperation housing. We've been involved in countless webinars and online meetings and forums, and we realised that Queensland doesn't have exposure to this type of housing. It just really hasn't developed it. And that Queensland, particularly South East Queensland, where we thought we could start, didn't know what it didn't know. And the one way to show people that this is actually possible was to run a series of seminars with the objective of seeding new pilot and demonstration projects. The reason that we thought that is that we've got a state government, fortunately, who's highly committed and hugely involved now in the provision of housing, because it has realised that it's got a waiting list of 25,000 people or applicants who've got behind them about 50 odd thousand other community members, like of their families and others, and that there's simply it kind of met the additional housing crisis that's now starting to impact mainstream Queensland people and families. So the timing was right. Finally, government was listening to the voices of a lot of different people saying, we're in crisis. This is serious. Essential workers can't even be employed because there's no housing for them to live in. So it wasn't our voice. Our voice got smaller, actually, as more voices grew. So we're now in the mix of a whole lot of people who are experiencing housing precarity and homelessness. So these seminars are an opportunity to bring local government and other levels of government to the table to listen to what might be a different type of housing. So we designed these seminars to be place-focused seminars across South East Queensland just to make it viable to actually hold them in a short period of time. I mean, if we had lots of time, maybe we could have done one up in the Tablelands or somewhere else in Queensland. But what we want to do is show that this type of housing is scalable and replicable, that it provides the type of housing that older women aspire to. We've got a survey on our website that we've got over 350 respondents to, all of them saying they don't want to live in a share house. They are doing so because they haven't got another option. They want to have independent living spaces and are willing to do things like access shared amenities and so on to enable them to have a higher standard of living and to be able to live in community, which is of value to them as we age. So we figured that if we could bring people together and seed the idea that we could run a pilot project in each of 4 locations, that pilot project could demonstrate ultimately that this type of housing is feasible, and to use it to work alongside state, local, and even federal government to say we need more of this type of housing. So that was our objective. We have no idea whether we'll be successful, but we're doing our best to bring people together and for them to at least get exposure to another type of housing. And we need a policy home at state and local governments to acknowledge this type of housing and to support it from the top down while protecting the bottom-up processes like community-led housing. We need it to be supported, but we don't want it taken over by the systems like state and local government. We want to work alongside them to create this type of housing.
There is a seminar part of the engagement series, which is really a sharing of information, letting folks hear about the different models, statistics, and case studies that prove their success, what has helped them work, and what has been the enabling factors, particularly at the local government level, because we can't always wait for nationwide legislation, but there's lots of levers that actually local government has available to it, the regulatory space around policy that they can do. And so we really want to make that awareness and bring in the voice of the women, why it is that they need and want this kind of housing, so that developers for purpose or the community housing providers say, yes, if we build it, we will definitely have people who want to live there. And then we're going to have some workshops following the seminar where people now armed with that knowledge and information can, in a place-based way, we've got 4 or 5 locations that people can, from that location, really start to strategize to say, well, what are the role players in our area? Who's living here? Who do we have available to us to assist, whether it be land availability, who are our local government folks that we need to work with, the other stakeholders, to be able to make a place-based pilot to see how is this going to work here. We've talked about the community land trust being a way that holds land for perpetually affordable housing, where the land is not owned as part of the housing, is separate from the land, which allows for ownership or secure rental of the property on top of that land, which I think is a great way for funders to be able to be involved, because they know that their funding is secure. In a land trust, it's not going to get lost when it's sold, if it cannot be sold back into the market. So that place-based workshop is hopefully going to bring the right role players together to start to put some strategy down that is going to take off to hopefully be a pilot project. And then from a pilot, we're hoping then that that is replicable either to other areas or within that same community. So it's very aspirational, but it is very doable. I've seen it work all over the world. And it's about energizing people, as well as knowing what challenges there will be along the way. About it's not going to be just an easy ride. And these are the ways that we're hopefully going to be able to work through these challenges.
I just wanted to add a little something. Housing Older Women movement is really keen that the situation for older women be improved. But I keep seeing all the time the logic, the reasons for everyone to be better housed, especially families, even in terms of the very young people that aren't in created their own family or couples. As all those essential workers, teachers and nurses and service people, including tradespeople, who would be able to be buying a house if these types of perpetually affordable developments could become fashionable in Queensland, because that's a whole raft of lower and middle income people who'd be in long-term housing at an affordable rate, and that takes some pressure off the list of people waiting at the door of every rental.
I just want to say the other really passionate point that we as Housing Older Women, in addition to that intergenerational living environment that we want to create, is that we want to leave a legacy for future generation of different housing choices, that those shared equity ownership models allow us to live securely and have a secure base. And if you listen to any of the discussions around children and home and families and women affected by domestic and family violence, that security of tenure is critical in providing stability. So this type of housing that offers that kind of stability and a partial ownership, because women's savings are going to pay off other people's mortgages while we live in poverty. So that is simply not an okay model. And the research says that within 3 to 4 years, most women's average savings are all gone. And then we become the people knocking on the door of the Department of Housing. But poverty is no longer enough to get on that register. You have to have a whole bunch of other complex needs now, because that's the way they've managed the register, so that even more people are not on it than what currently are. So we want to leave a legacy of different housing types and models that become real choices for a whole bunch of people. So that's our goal, really.
I love that. Even though it's housing older women, and it's so inclusive, really, that if we can put women at the center, it actually does benefit so many more groups. So I just love the inclusivity of the values. We've said who we want to come. We definitely want the various levels of government, incremental or for-purpose developers, not-for-profit organizations, housing providers, as well as the women themselves who would like to live in such housing. And banks, financiers, investors all need to be there because they all have a role to play. We actually do need this diversity of participants in these projects. So let's move into what are the dates and locations? Where can people find the information and register?
Well, we have just opened up registrations. There's a couple of events that still need fine tuning around a venue and additional activity, but it's with Humanitex. Now, I'll put a link on the Housing Older Women's Movement website. So it's housingolderwomen.org.au. And you will really actually find a wealth of information there about these events and promotional material and links to registration on Humanitex. If you go to Humanitex and you put in Housing Older Women, you'll find the registrations there as well. So we have 5 events being planned. They begin the first one on the 10th at the Gold Coast. And at this point, we have a local counsellor who will welcome you to that event. It's for 2 hours. And then in the afternoon, if the information you've heard at the seminar ignites your interest further, we anticipate you will want to stay for another couple of hours and drill into what would this look like in our local area. And we won't get into every single facet of what would be involved, but there is an opportunity for further down the track, having perhaps an online discussion with Zola, but also having discussions with the other 4 local areas that hopefully have seeded a new initiative as well, so that we have people coming together from across South East Queensland to share their learning, to gain insight, to do some research together, to make connections, all that good stuff, so that it builds momentum towards a kind of peer learning space, so that we learn how to do this together, because we are learning something new together here. We do have a special event on the 18th of September, and that's both an online option as well as coming to the University of Queensland campus in the city for a meeting there. And that meeting is important because it's people with professional sort of involvement in the housing and housing sector. So people who are into planning, into design, into other facets of development across different sectors, coming together to look at both the barriers and enablers to this type of housing in Queensland and what opportunities there are to shift the barriers and to work together to do that. The other places that we're having these gatherings and seminars is in South Brisbane, and that'll be actually at the Food Connect shed in South Brisbane. And in North Brisbane, it's at Northgate Community Hall.
It is on Monday, the 16th of September.
And then we have one on the Sunshine Coast, and that's on Thursday the 12th. So each of those 4 physical locations will be face-to-face meetings and follow-up workshop sessions as well. And then the special hybrid one on the 18th of September. And we did have a meeting with the Minister for Housing, Megan Scanlon, and she was kind of interested in all of this. Anyway, she's helped us set up another meeting with Kelly Manigan, who's the head of the Social and Affordable Housing Growth Team. So we're meeting with her next week, and we've written to the mayors and the local councillors, and the one in North Brisbane will have our local councillor here, who's also chair of the planning committee. That's Councillor Alan. He's been wonderfully supportive, and we've got local council staff involved. So we're doing lots of work to get the right people to the table, but we shall see what happens. And we're very excited that Zola's coming and bringing her experience from New Zealand to help us shine a light on the things that matter here and how we can bring about the things that might be of a challenge to us, how we can work that through. So it's very exciting to have you come, Zola.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. And we share so many of the same challenges. So that as we grow it in Australia, hopefully we also get inspired here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to follow suit. So that, yeah, we're able to combine our knowledge and our activities. This is wonderful. HOW has really taken a more longer term look at what really is making a home and community belonging. And that's where we need to be moving for women, not just thinking about them as victims of the system that just need something in a quick fix way. We need long-term, wonderful places to live.
Not just
So
for them, but for their children as well, Zola. That stability is critical, really. And I must say that one of the things that I love about the idea of this type of housing is that it offers passive surveillance of the neighborhood. We can't have a policeman on every doorstep, but we can have neighbors who care enough and who are brave enough and who are willing enough to keep an eye on situations. And if we live in mixed communities, intergenerational communities like this, we will be able to build resilient neighbourhoods like that.
Joining Earth Song's group in New Zealand, it was already clear then from research that mixed population has a wonderful uplifting effect on everybody. And a lot of the very valuable community input comes from people who haven't got a big income, but they are very inclined, and that makes life much more friendly and neighbourly for all their subdivision or their street.
well, we'll conclude the show with just letting people know again where they can go to get information. There is the Housing Older Women Movement website where they can then find the links to register for the events. They will start on the 10th of September, but of course we want them to check out some of the resources and register way before, because we're going to have some email that so that people can have a little bit of a background with this new information we're sharing. We'd like to catch everybody up even before the event starts. So please do register early so that you can get the information in advance. And then my website, if you're interested to just see the kind of work that I'm doing, it's commonground.net.nz, where you can find out about Common Ground.